Welcome to Spiritual Minefield. Today we're going to take a quick look at where the Nephilim giants. Stay tuned. Okay, so we're going to go to two places. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 6 and Exodus 13. Some Christians believe that Nephilims were not giants. The Septuagint, meaning the translation of the Hebrew text to the Greek, they translated it as giants for Nephilim. Now, they say that the Nephilims were not giant. So what does the scripture say? The best way to know something is to let the scripture interpret itself. And we're going to see that today. So let's go now to Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. And it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterward as well, when the sons of God had relations with the daughters of men, and they bore them children who became the mighty men of old, men of renown. So, of course, in Genesis chapter 6, it doesn't talk about them being really tall and, in stature. It doesn't say anything about the Nephilim being really big or giants or anything like that. Now, does the scripture somewhere else say that the Nephilims were giant? Okay, so for this, we're going to go to Exodus chapter 13 right here. So let's go there real quick. And we're going to start in verse 30. And this is when the Israelites went to Canaan to spy out the land, and they saw giants in there. So look what it's interesting, because look what they said about the Nephilim. It says, then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, we must go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly conquer it. This man had a lot of faith. But the men who had gone up with him replied, we cannot go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And they're going to elaborate why they're stronger. So these people here did not have the faith that Caleb had. But anyways, continuing to verse 32. So they gave the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had spied out. The land we explored devour its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are great in stature. So here they're saying that the people there are really tall, and they're going to give you a reference how tall they look like. In verse 33, you're going to see that. We even saw the Nephilim there. Now, we know that in Genesis 6, only 8 people survived. The Nephilims could not survive, but they believe that the descendants who they're going to name there came from the Nephilims. So it says here, we even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak that come from the Nephilim. So the people that saw there were from Anak, and they were very tall. So they think that they came from the descendants of the Nephilims. Now the question is, how can they come from the descendants of the Nephilims if the Nephilims, all of them, were wiped out in the flood? Well, the only explanation could be is that one of the wives of Noah's sons probably had the gene of the giants. So then Ham, who his descendants went to Canaan, most likely had the genes of the giants, and people grew in stature there. So most likely it was from a gene from one of the wives of Noah's sons. We seem like grasshoppers in our own sight, and we must have seemed the same to them. So basically their perspective is they were as small as a grasshopper compared to a human. Basically, I know they're using language that's very exaggerated, but here you have an idea how tall they were. They were so tall, probably 9 feet, 10, 12 feet, who knows, that they seem so small. They looked at each other and looked at them and said, wow, we're like a grasshopper, we're nothing. So that's why they were so scared. Now, the question is here, they equate Nephilim to giants, because they said that the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilims. And then they're saying that the Anak, the people there, were super tall. So here the scripture clearly identifies the Nephilim as giants. And the only way that the Israelites knew about the Nephilim had to come from Moses, because Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. So Moses knew who the Nephilims were. And most likely Moses told the Israelites that the Nephilims were giants in the beginning of time when God created the world before the flood occurred. So you see here, the scripture clearly identifies the Nephilims as giants, meaning the scripture interprets itself, and the scripture itself says that the Nephilims were giants. And by the way, when they said that the Nephilims were giants, or that the descendants of Anak came from the Nephilims because they were giants, as you could see here, no one is corrected. Nobody corrected them saying that, no, they're not giants, or they couldn't come from the Nephilim because the Nephilims were not giant or anything like that. They were not corrected. So here the scriptures identifies Nephilims as being really tall, giants. So there you have it. The Nephilims were truly giants. Thank you for listening.